And the 426 Hemi's price tag could boost the bottom line over $800.
In 1964, Chrysler built a race engine so dominant that NASCAR told its teams to sandbag during practice. Not slow down a little, sandbag. The governing body of stock car racing looked at what Chrysler had done and basically said, please don't let anyone see how fast that thing is. 7 years later, Chrysler killed it. Not because it stopped winning, because it was too expensive to exist. This is the story of the 426 Hemi, the engine they called the Elephant, an engine born in wartime, perfected for racing, shoved into streetcars against its will, and ultimately strangled to death by insurance companies, emissions laws, and the cold math of a balance sheet. It made 425 horsepower. Officially, the real number was higher. Chrysler lied about it on purpose, and we'll get to why. But first, you need to understand what was happening at Chrysler in the early 1960s. The company was getting embarrassed, badly. On the track, Ford and GM were winning everything worth winning. Pontiac had been dominating NASCAR with their factory-backed teams. Ford was pouring money into racing programs with a vengeance. And Chrysler was watching from the grandstands with wedge-head engines that were strong on short tracks, but couldn't keep pace on the big superspeedways, where top-end breathing and raw horsepower decided who took the checkered flag. The company had been out of serious Hemi competition since they shelved their original firepower engines back in 1958. That was 4 years of watching Ford and GM celebrate in victory lane, while Chrysler's maximum displacement wedge engines, good as they were, kept finishing in the wrong part of the field. The 426 Max wedge was a monster on the drag strip, but NASCAR was where the real marketing dollars lived. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. That was the formula. And Chrysler was losing on Sunday. Then Lynn Townsend became president of Chrysler Corporation. Townsend looked at the competition, looked at what winning races meant for dealership traffic, and decided enough was enough. In December of 1962, Chrysler's engineering staff got a memo. The directive was straightforward: develop an engine and vehicle combination capable of winning stock car races on closed-circuit tracks. Also, build a version for drag racing. The deadline was the 1964 Daytona 500. That gave them roughly 15 months for a brand new engine program. 15 months. The man leading the charge was Willem Weertman, Chrysler's chief engine engineer. Weertman and his team made a critical decision early. They weren't starting from scratch. They'd use the existing 426 wedge block as a foundation, the big RB series, casting that had proven its strength in competition. But the top end, the cylinder heads, that's where the magic would happen. They were going back to the hemisphere. See, Chrysler had history with hemispherical combustion chambers. During World War II, their engineers built a massive inverted V16 with Hemi chambers for the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter, 2,500 horsepower. It flew. It worked. Then jet engines made it irrelevant. But the knowledge went into filing cabinets in Highland Park, Michigan. In the 50s, Chrysler pulled that research back out and built their firepower Hemi road engines. Strong, efficient, also expensive to manufacture. 2 rocker shafts per head instead of 1. Valves at steep opposing angles. More machining, more parts, more money. They dropped them in '58 because wedge-head engines were cheaper and nearly as powerful. Now, Weertman's team was bringing the concept back with one goal: win. Not cost, not drivability, win. The thing about a hemispherical combustion chamber is geometry. The dome shape creates an efficient surface-to-volume ratio. Less heat escapes through the head walls. More pressure pushes the piston. More power. But that's only part of it. The real advantage is the valves. In a wedge-head engine, the valves sit roughly parallel, limited in size by the bore. In a Hemi, they're canted at opposing angles, 58.5 degrees apart. This lets you fit valves that are physically larger than any wedgehead could accommodate. Bigger valves, more airflow, more power. The spark plug sits dead center at the top of the dome. When it fires, the flame front spreads evenly. Clean burn, consistent pressure. The trade-off? Complexity. Each cylinder needs opposing rocker arms, push rods at weird angles, and a valve train that looks like it was designed by someone who hated mechanics. The heads are wide. The engine is enormous. Engineers nicknamed it the Elephant. The thing weighed 842 pounds dry. The block had to be stress-relieved at the factory to prevent cracking. Cross-bolted steel main bearing caps held the crankshaft. This was not a casual engine. By February of 1964, they had it ready. Just barely. Tom Hoover, the engineer who led the Hemi's combustion chamber development, personally worked with the race teams to get the engines dialed in for Daytona. The testing had been promising, more than promising, terrifying actually, for the competition. February 23, 1964, Daytona International Speedway, 2.5 miles of high-banked asphalt in Daytona Beach, Florida. Richard Petty, 26 years old, already showing flashes of the driver who'd become the king, climbing into his number 43 Plymouth Belvedere. Under the hood, a brand new 426 Hemi. In practice, the Chrysler cars had been so fast that NASCAR officials took the unusual step of ordering the teams to sandbag during qualifying. Hold back. Don't show everyone how much faster you are. Think about that for a second. The governing body of the sport told competitors to not go as fast as they could because the gap was embarrassing. Petty started on the front row. Early in the race, a bungled pit stop dropped him to 15th. Didn't matter. The combination of Petty's talent and the Hemi's power was irresistible. He carved through the field and took the lead, and kept it. He led 184 of the 200 laps. That record still stands today, more than 60 years later. Nobody has ever dominated the Daytona 500 like that. The first 3 cars across the finish line were Plymouths, all powered by the Hemi. Chrysler took 4 of the top 5 spots. Petty won by a full lap and 9 seconds over Jimmy Pardue in second. The average speed was 154.3 miles per hour, a new Daytona record. It wasn't a race. It was a demonstration. Ford was furious. They went to NASCAR and complained loudly. The argument, you can't buy a 426 Hemi at your local Plymouth dealer. It's a racing engine. Nobody's neighbor has one. And Ford had a point. Chrysler had built it exclusively for competition. There was no street version. Ford's anger was so intense they built their own hemispherical engine in response. The 427 SO-HC Cammer, reportedly close to 700 horsepower. NASCAR wouldn't let that race either. The Hemi had kicked off an arms race. NASCAR agreed with Ford's complaint. For the 1965 season, the Hemi was banned. If Chrysler wanted to race it, they had to sell it to the public first, put it in regular production cars, meet the homologation requirements. Chrysler's response was to boycott the entire 1965 NASCAR season. Just like that, they pulled every car, every team, every dollar. Richard Petty, the reigning champion, the guy who'd just led 184 laps at Daytona, sat out the whole year from stock car racing. He went drag racing instead, running a Hemi-powered Barracuda and winning match races against some of the biggest names in the sport. Chrysler used the boycott year to prove a point, but they also used it to plan. When Chrysler came back in '66 with the street Hemi and production cars, Richard Petty won the Daytona 500 again, made him the first driver ever to win it twice, this time with a D-stroked 404 cubic inch version required by NASCAR's rules for superspeedways over a mile, proving that even with 22 fewer cubic inches, the hemispherical chamber design was still untouchable. The Hemi was back, and it was angry. What they did to create the street version changed everything and created a problem that would eventually kill the engine. Bob Roger and Bob Cahill at Chrysler saw the writing on the wall. NASCAR wasn't going to back down. If Chrysler wanted back in, they needed a street Hemi. So in 1965, engineering got the memo. Build a hemispherical combustion chamber engine for the B-Series platform. Make it streetable. Cast iron exhaust manifolds instead of headers. Solid lifters are acceptable, but not preferred. Make it work in a car your neighbor could theoretically drive to the grocery store. The engineers had to detune a pure race engine for street use. Compression dropped from 12.5 to 1 down to 10.25 to 1 for pump gasoline. Aluminum heads became cast iron. Milder camshaft. Redesigned intake manifold with dual 4-barrel Carter A, FB carburetors instead of the cross-ram racing setup. The combustion chamber was tilted slightly so the exhaust rocker wouldn't be too long, which actually narrowed the engine enough to fit on the Dodge main production line without special body drops. The result was the street Hemi, officially rated at 425 horsepower at 5,000 RPM and 490 pound-feet of torque at 4,000 RPM. Those numbers were a lie, a deliberate, strategic, corporate lie. Here's why. Insurance companies in the late 1960s priced premiums based partly on advertised horsepower. The higher the number, the higher the premium. Chrysler knew that if they published the real output, insurance rates on Hemi-equipped cars would be devastating. So they sandbagged. The official rating was 425. Independent dyno testing on bone stock street Hemis has produced numbers closer to 494 horsepower at 5,950 RPM, with headers instead of the restrictive cast-iron exhaust manifolds, over 520 horsepower. They were underrating the engine by roughly 70 horsepower on purpose, and it still wasn't enough to save buyers from the insurance companies. When the Street Hemi debuted as a factory option in 1966, it cost $908. That's roughly $9,000 adjusted for inflation. But the sticker price was only the beginning. The Hemi option came with mandatory upgrades: heavy-duty suspension, upgraded transmission, beefier rear axle. You couldn't just bolt a Hemi into a base model. The car had to be built to handle it. And then there was the warranty. Every other V8 in the Chrysler lineup came with a 5-year, 50,000-mile warranty. The Hemi, 1 year, 12,000 miles. Chrysler essentially told buyers, "We know what you're going to do with this engine, and we're not covering the consequences. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week." Okay, back to it. So the Street Hemi was expensive to buy, expensive to insure, and came with a warranty that basically said good luck. The result was predictable. Almost nobody bought one. In 1966, the Dodge Charger sold 37,344 units. 468 got the Hemi. That's 1.3%. The Plymouth Belvedere lineup moved over 200,000 cars. 734 got Hemis. The pattern held every single year. The 426 was available in Chargers, Coronets, Belvederes, Satellites, GTXS, Roadrunners, Super Bs, Challengers, and Barracudas. It didn't matter. The take rate was always tiny. Across 6 years of production, from 1966 through 1971, Chrysler built fewer than 10,000 Street Hemis total. Some sources say 9,778. Others put it closer to 10,900, including the race engines. Either way, for a major manufacturer over 6 model years, that's nothing. The cars that did get the Hemi became instant legends. The 1968 Dodge Charger, with its Coke bottle curves and aggressive stance, sold over 96,000 units in its first year. Dodge had planned for 35,000 and couldn't believe the demand. But the Hemi version? Across the entire second-generation Charger ART production run, just 875 got the Hemi. The most iconic muscle car of the era, paired with the most iconic engine, and almost nobody bought the combination. Hollywood loved the Chargers so much, they wrecked them by the dozens for shows and movies. Finding a surviving Hemi Charger today is like finding a needle in a field of haystacks. Then there were the Aerocars. In 1969, the NASCAR wars went completely insane. Dodge built the Charger Daytona with a pointed nose cone and a towering rear wing that looked like something out of a cartoon. 503 were built for homologation. 70 got the Hemi. Plymouth responded with the Superbird for 1970, complete with its own nose cone and wing. These cars could break 200 miles per hour on the superspeedways. They were so fast that NASCAR changed the rules again, restricting wing cars to smaller engines, while allowing standard-bodied cars to run bigger ones. The Aero Wars were over almost as soon as they started, but the images of those winged Hemi-powered Mopars screaming around Daytona and Talladega remain some of the most iconic in racing history. In 1970, Chrysler finally shoehorned the Hemi into their E-body pony cars. The Dodge Challenger and Plymouth Barracuda, smaller and lighter than the B-body intermediates, became the ultimate street weapons. A Hemi Cuda could cover the quarter mile in the low 13s at over 105 miles per hour, straight from the factory, no modifications, in 1970. That was obscenely fast. The problem was cost, not just purchase cost. Total cost of ownership. By 1970, insurance companies had declared war on muscle cars. A young buyer trying to insure a Hemi-equipped anything was looking at premiums that could exceed the car's monthly payment. The engine itself was expensive to manufacture. All those extra machining operations on the hemispherical heads, the dual rocker shafts, the cross-bolted mains, the stress-relieved block. Every 426 Hemi that rolled off the line cost Chrysler significantly more to build than a 440 wedge, which made nearly as much power for most practical purposes. The 446 pack, with its 3 two-barrel carburetors, put out 390 horsepower and matched the Hemi's 490 pound-feet of torque. It cost hundreds less. It was lighter. It was easier to service. For 90% of buyers, it was the smarter choice. Now let's talk about what actually made this engine special from a technical standpoint. Because the numbers alone don't tell the full story. The 426 displaces 426 cubic inches, 7 liters. Bore is 4¼ inches. Stroke is 3¾ over square, meaning the bore is wider than the stroke is long. That's a deliberate choice for high RPM. Shorter stroke means less piston travel, less stress at speed, and the ability to rev higher without self-destructing. The block is cast iron, with a deck height of 10.72 inches and bore spacing of 4.8 inches. Largest engine in racing at its debut. Cylinder walls were thickened after early testing revealed cracking. Every block stress-relieved at the factory. The crankshaft rides in 5 main bearings, held by cross-bolted steel caps, secured both vertically and horizontally through the block. The bottom end is virtually indestructible. Drag racers have pushed these engines well past 1,000 horsepower on the original bottom end. The heads are where the Hemi earns its name. The combustion chamber dome measures 4.84 inches in diameter, with a center depth of 1.34 inches. Not a perfect hemisphere, but the principle holds. Intake valves measure 2.14 inches. Exhaust valves are 1.94. For comparison, a Chevy big block ran intake valves around 2.06. The Hemi's advantage in valve area translates directly into airflow, but those big valves angled in opposite directions require a complicated valve train. Each head has 2 rocker shafts, push rods of different lengths at unusual angles. The whole assembly is heavier than conventional setups, limiting valve speed. This is why Chrysler never went to 4 valves per cylinder. The angles would be impossible. The intake uses a dual quad setup, 2 Carter A, FB 4-barrel carburetors on an aluminum manifold. Together, they can support well over 500 horsepower. The exhaust manifolds are cast iron and frankly terrible. Restrictive. Every drag racer immediately threw them in the trash and bolted on headers. Oil pressure runs at 90 pounds at 1,500 RPM. The engine needs it. Starting in 1970, the street Hemi switched from solid lifters to hydraulic, a concession to drivability. Hydraulic lifters can't rev as high, but they don't need periodic adjustment. Chrysler acknowledging that this was supposed to be nominally a street engine. By 1970, the walls were closing in from every direction. The Clean Air Act established the EPA and set aggressive emission standards. High compression engines running on leaded gasoline were living on borrowed time. Catalytic converters, soon to be mandatory, couldn't survive leaded fuel. Without lead, the high octane ratings that the Hemi depended on weren't available at the pump. Insurance premiums for muscle cars had become genuinely prohibitive. A young buyer trying to insure a Hemi anything was looking at annual premiums that could rival the car payment. Some insurers refused to write policies on Hemi cars at all, and Chrysler was hemorrhaging money. The company's finances in the late 60s were precarious. Every dollar spent manufacturing a complex, low-volume engine was a dollar not going toward the sedans and wagons that paid the bills. The 440 wedge made business sense. The Hemi made engineering sense. Business won. It always does. The competitors felt the same pressure. GM issued internal directives limiting displacement. Ford was pulling back from racing. The entire muscle car era was dying from 1,000 cuts. Emissions, insurance, safety regulations adding weight. The Hemi was just one of the last guests to leave the party. Willem Veertman, the man who'd overseen the Hemi's creation from that first memo in '62 all the way through to its retirement, later explained the decision with characteristic directness. There had to be a choice, he said, about whether to continue that level of engineering work, or to say the Hemi has done its job. Let's discontinue it now. They didn't want it to ever get a flavor of being a mild-mannered engine. That's an engineer talking. He'd rather kill it than watch it get watered down with lower compression and choked exhaust systems until it was just another engine with a famous name. So in 1970, internally, they made the call. Stop production after the '71 model year. Let the elephant die with its dignity intact. The final year was barely a whisper. In 1971, Chrysler built just 368 Hemi-powered cars across all brands. Dodge produced 168 of them, 75 Charger RTs, 71 Challenger RTs, 22 Super Bs. Plymouth built 200, 115 Cudas, 55 Roadrunners, 30 GTX S. That's it. 368 cars, from a company that sold hundreds of thousands of vehicles that year. The 1971 Hemi Cuda convertible became the rarest of the rare. Plymouth built just 11 convertibles with the Hemi that final year, 7 for the domestic market, 3 with 4-speed manuals, 1 single car in B5 blue with a matching blue interior and 4-speed. That car became the most expensive muscle car ever sold at public auction. We'll get to the number later. It's absurd. The Hemi name went dark for over 3 decades. The original tooling wasn't destroyed immediately, but production was done. The last 426 Street Hemi rolled off the line, and that was it. No fanfare, no special edition, just an accounting decision and a legendary engine quietly disappearing from the option sheets. Except it didn't really disappear. Not from racing, not even close. In NHRA drag racing, the 426 Hemi became the foundation for professional competition in a way that defied every expectation. The basic architecture proved almost infinitely scalable. Aluminum versions of the Hemi, running on nitromethane fuel, power virtually every top fuel dragster and funny car on the planet. Not most of them, virtually all of them. Even cars with Ford or Chevy logos painted on the body. Underneath, it's a Hemi. These engines now displace around 500 cubic inches, with superchargers the size of small suitcases bolted on top. They produce over 11,000 horsepower. They consume close to 400 gallons of nitro per minute at full throttle. They cover a quarter mile in under 3.5 seconds at speeds over 330 miles per hour. And the combustion chamber? Still hemispherical. Still, essentially, the same geometry that Weertman's team drew up in 1963. More than 60 years later, nobody has found anything better for the job. That fact alone tells you everything about how right they got it the first time. On the NASCAR side, displacement rules eventually banned big block engines entirely, pushing the sport toward smaller, more regulated power plants. But the Hemi had already done what it was designed to do. It won races. It won championships. It terrified Ford badly enough that they built their own Hemi engine in response. It made the name Chrysler synonymous with raw power in a way that no advertising budget could have bought. On the streetcar side, Chrysler brought the Hemi name back in 2003 with a 5.7-liter V8 that shared the hemispherical branding, but almost nothing else with the original. Smaller valve angles, completely different architecture, 2 spark plugs per cylinder, variable valve timing, cylinder deactivation for fuel economy. It was a modern engine wearing a vintage name, and it sold like crazy. The take rate hovered around 50%. Half the people buying Chrysler products wanted the Hemi badge. The marketing magic of a name that had been out of production for 32 years. But those modern Hemis aren't really Hemis. Not in the way the 426 was. The combustion chamber isn't truly hemispherical. The valve angle is 34.5 degrees instead of 58.5. The engineering philosophy is completely different. Efficiency and emissions, compliance instead of maximum power, regardless of consequences. It's the name on a different idea. The original 426 lives on in a different way, in garages and barns and temperature-controlled collections around the world. Fewer than 10,000 were built. Many were destroyed on drag strips and in weekend street races by guys who thought they could handle 425 horsepower on bias ply tires with drum brakes. They couldn't. Many more were pulled from wrecked or rusted cars and lost to time. The attrition rate was savage. A numbers-matching 426 Hemi engine, just the engine sitting on a stand with no car attached, routinely sells for $50,000. That's more than a brand new Hellcat crate engine that makes 707 horsepower. The old Hemi makes less power and costs more money, and people pay it without blinking. Put one in the right car with the right paperwork, and you're looking at 6 figures easily. 7 figures for the rarest configurations. A 1971 Hemi Cuda convertible, one of only 11 built that final year, sold at a Mecum auction in 2014 for $3.5 million. $3.5 million for a car that listed for under $5,000 new. In 1993, Mopar Performance started manufacturing new Hemi blocks and components because demand from the racing and restoration community never went away. You can buy a brand new 426 Hemi crate engine today. It'll cost you, but you can do it. The engine that was too expensive to build in 1971 is now too valuable to let die. There's something fitting about that. Chrysler killed the Hemi because it didn't make financial sense. The engine cost too much to manufacture. The insurance companies priced buyers out of the market. And emissions laws were about to make high-compression engines illegal anyway. Every rational argument pointed toward discontinuation, and every single one of those arguments was correct in 1971. But here's what the accountants didn't put in their spreadsheets. The 426 Hemi became the most coveted engine in American automotive history. The cars it powered sell for more money than anyone in 1971 could have imagined. The name itself became worth millions in marketing value when Chrysler revived it 3 decades later. And the basic architecture still dominates the most extreme form of motorsport on Earth. They killed the elephant because it was too expensive to feed. Turns out, it was priceless. And there you have it, the 426 Hemi, an engine so good it got banned, so expensive it got killed, and so legendary it refuses to stay dead. If you've ever seen one in person, or heard one at full song, you know there's nothing else like it. Let me know in the comments if you think Chrysler made the right call, or if they should have found a way to keep it alive. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. We've got plenty.